On today's video, we're going to be doing a review of this 30th anniversary edition of Alice in Chains Jar of Flies. But not only am I going to review this pressing, I'm going to compare it to this music on vinyl copy that, as of the filming of this video, sells for 8 times as much as the 30th anniversary edition. Before we get into that, I'm going to walk you through my personal history with this album. We'll take a look at the packaging of each, and then we'll get into the most important part, the sound, with a track-by-track breakdown of both of these pressings. And maybe we'll answer the question, is one pressing possibly worth 8 times more than another? I don't know. I guess we're going to find out. This is the VU Meters YouTube channel. I'm Rich, and thank you for joining me on another journey deep into the grooves of these pressings. I'll never forget the first time I heard this album. It was summer vacation. I was of the age where we spent our days riding our bikes, playing stickball, and playing manhunt. And one of the kids in the neighborhood borrowed a cassette from his brother, and it was Alice in Chains' Jar of Flies. And from the moment I heard Rotten Apple, I've been hooked on this album and Alice in Chains ever since. This is definitely an all-killer, no-filler album. It's 7 tracks and just barely over 30 minutes of music. My personal favorite on this is Don't Follow. Some other notable tracks on this are I Stay Away, which opens the Alice in Chains Unplugged album, and No Excuses, which is also on there. And if you got a copy of that on vinyl, good for you, because that was a big miss by me and something that I do not have in my collection. But what I do have, and I would say I luck-sacked into, is a music on vinyl pressing. When I got back into buying vinyl records, this was still in print, and as soon as I saw it, I knew I had to have it and snatched it up. And luckily for me, I did that when I did, because this has jumped up significantly in price since then. The length of this album, and more importantly, my deep connection to it, has made this one of the easiest and most enjoyable reviews and comparisons I had to do. So next, we'll take a look at the packaging, and then we'll get into the most important part, the sound. Here's the packaging for the 30th anniversary edition. You can see the image on the front picture is not very sharp at all. It's also a very thin cardstock, like almost like an inner sleeve type of thickness compared to some other albums, but you don't listen to the jacket. And here's the inner sleeve. Again, it's very thin, printed inner. It's almost got paper material that it's on. Sometimes these are like a heavier cardstock, which is a little nicer. I don't use these anyways. I immediately take the records out of them and never put them back in, but I do keep them stored with the jacket. And that is the packaging for the 30th anniversary edition. And now the music on vinyl packaging. You can see to my eye, this comes across as having like deeper, richer color, but it is an extremely almost blurry picture. There's almost no sharpness at all on that image. It comes across as very pixelated. So the back cover of this is actually on the inside of the gatefold. This one also comes with a printed inner sleeve, just like the 30th anniversary. Again, the color is much deeper, richer color on this. The paper stock on it is much, much heavier. The paper stock on this inner sleeve is almost as thick as the outer jacket on the 30th anniversary. And being that this is a twofer, you have Alice in Chains SAP cover on the back. I'd call it the back because it does have the barcode on there. And on the other side of the inside of the gatefold is the back of the SAP album. That is the packaging for the music on vinyl version. Now for the labels, similar to the jackets, I do notice a sort of deeper, richer color at the music on vinyl, which is on the left, compared to the 30th anniversary, which is on the right. One thing to note is that there is a little difference on the center label here, where it does have the music on vinyl logo right beside Columbia. So that's one way to tell that it's the music on vinyl. And we'll get into another way that you can tell the difference by looking at them when we look at the other side of the 30th anniversary. So here we have on the left-hand side the music on vinyl, which to my eyes does have a deeper, richer color. On the right-hand side, we have the side that has the track listing for the 30th anniversary vinyl. One thing that you will notice, unlike the music on vinyl or the original, is the way that they've split up these tracks. So there's only 7 tracks on this album. In the original and the music on vinyl had them split up 5 on the first side, 2 songs on the second side. They split these up with 4 songs on the first side for the 30th anniversary with 3 songs on the second side, which now brings us to the most important part. How do these sound? So now let's go to some listening impressions. Kicking things off with the latest copy, the 30th anniversary issue. One thing I noticed right out of the gate with this is it was cut slightly hotter, and by slight I mean very slight, like 1 or 2 notches on the preamp that I had to turn it down. That was about it. I also noticed a little noise in between the tracks. I would not call this pressing noisy at all. I know some people, from what I've read online, haven't been as lucky and have commented with pretty significant noise on theirs. I, fortunately, did not have that issue. So I dropped the needle and started with Rotten Apple. One thing I noticed right away is that the soundstage was wide, but it wasn't as deep, and a lot of the imaging started to blur. One example in particular is when the harmonica part comes in. You can't really pick out where it's coming from. Like, everything just kind of gets muddled. There's no like imaging definition in between the different parts. Similar thing with Nutshell. One example of that on Nutshell is with the kick drum. Like with the kick drum, you hear the initial impact, but then it just dies off sudden and fast. Like it's just like a... On I Stay Away, again, not as much air in between the instruments. You can really locate and hear where the guitars are coming from. Like it sounds like they're coming directly from the speakers at you. Without that depth, it's hard to pick out sort of where they are. Like everything's happening across, but really not front to back, which I think causes it to have a little more directionality where you can hear all the sound is coming at you directly from speakers, which again is not really what you want when you're listening to records. I like having that big, deep, wide sound stage where it feels like I'm sitting in the middle of a presentation of music. And the last track on this side was No Excuses. Again, same flat sound stage. This one in particular sounded a little hollow. It sounded like a lot of the mids were scooped out. Now on side 2 for this. Now this is where the music on vinyl and original pressing vary from this 30th anniversary. There's 7 total tracks and about 30 minutes of music on this album. On the OG and the MOV, there's 5 tracks on the first side and only 2 on the second side. This splits them up a little more evenly in terms of the amount and time of music on each side, where there's 4 tracks on the first side and 3 on the second side. So side 2 with this kicks off with Whale and the Wasp. I actually think that it benefited this song the most. I felt like this was the presentation that sounded sort of the most like the MOV. You could really hear the fingers moving along the strings. You know, the guitar tone was there. It did sound a little drier in comparison to the music on vinyl. And now my favorite song on this album, Don't Follow. This is track 1 on the music on vinyl, but it's pushed up a track to track 2 on side 2 of the 30th anniversary. And I don't know if it's where it's positioned on it, but this one really struggled. The vocal and imaging was sharp and well-defined for this pressing, but it did sound a little bit bass shy. Comparing it to the MOV, it does sound a little drier. The imaging and the vocal was the best on this copy, but again, I think the MOV did it better. In the last track swing on this, the bass sounded a little loose to kick off this song on this version, so it was deep, but it was a little loose and a little flabby. Was lacking a little bit of high end. You especially notice it on the cymbals and on the guitar solo at the end. I felt like a little bit of the highs were chopped off. And that is the 30th anniversary pressing of Alice in Chains' Jar of Flies. And now on to what's been my old standby, the music on vinyl pressing that I've had for years. This pressing, dead quiet, no noise, even in between the tracks. Didn't have to change my preamp at all, kind of cut around the same level of most of the records that I listen to. Dropping the needle on this one on Rotten Apple. Notice not only that huge wide sound stage that you had on the 30th, but it was also much taller and much deeper. So there was a lot more room for the performance to happen in. So you got like huge vocal, really good harmonics that you didn't hear with the 30th anniversary. Similar thing on Nutshell, like one of the things I mentioned was with that kick drum. You just kind of hear the initial like impact and it just dies off completely on the 30th. That doesn't happen here at all. You really hear that initial impact and you hear the bass drum kind of well up and roll off, which was a really great effect that I loved. On I Stay Away, awesome definition between the left and right channel guitars. They don't sound like they're coming directly from the guitars, like the left is sort of off and behind in the corner, and similar thing with the right. When the guitar solo comes in, it's even better with all three guitars. You can really hear the air and the space around them. Had a really, really big vocal, and you notice that height and that air, especially on the cymbals. You kind of hear them almost floating off into outer space. Now on to No Excuses. Excellent imaging, probably the best on this copy or any of the copies. Locked in lead vocal, got much bigger when the background vocals come in the chorus section. Even wider gap really between this and the 30th, because the things the 30th does poorly, this does extremely well, and that track No Excuses is an example where I think it stands out the most as the biggest gap between the two. Now on to the last track of this side of the pressing, and the first track of the second side of the 30th anniversary, Whale and Wasp, which is an instrumental. Great decay on the guitars. You can hear those fingers moving across the strings. I did get some very slight distortion at the end of the track. Maybe that's because this is the last track on this side, so maybe it's suffering from a little intergroove distortion, but nothing too terrible. You do hear that like big roll off of like those loud, almost like shrieking guitars at the end that are supposed to sound like a Wasp according to Jerry Cantrell. One thing I will say with the breakdown of this is the OCD in me likes the fact that there's 7 tracks and they're broken up almost evenly between the two sides on the 30th. But I think in the original, the reason they did it this way and why I think it works better on the MOV is just because of the vibe. Like going from Whale and the Wasp, getting up, flipping it over, starting with an almost entirely acoustic track with Don't Follow, the vibe is just right. When you flip it over on the 30th anniversary and you have Whale and the Wasp, and you have these like wailing guitars at the end of the solo, and then you hear that opening acoustic guitar on Don't Follow, it does feel a little bit out of place. I don't know if that's just the vibe or if it's just the way I'm used to listening to it. But I actually do prefer, even though the OCD in me likes splitting things up evenly, I do prefer the way they laid the tracks out on this, which takes us to flipping this one over to Don't Follow, my favorite song. Big wide soundstage, better imaging, better separation between the lead vocal, the background vocal, the harmonica. All sounds amazing. The guitars really feel more detached from the speakers, and I think it has to do with that depth. Like you really have that area and that space for all of the imaging to have its own air around it and sort of throw not only a wide soundstage, but a deep and tall soundstage as well. And now the last track of the album, Swing on This, deep, tight bass. The bass was deep, but it was a little flabby sounding at times on the 30th anniversary, and a much taller soundstage that you can hear on this was one of the things that stuck out to me. And those are my impressions of the Music on Vinyl pressing of Alice in Chains' Jar of Flies. So final thoughts. What do I think of this 30th anniversary pressing of Alice in Chains' Jar of Flies? I like it, and I'm glad it's out there and I'm glad it exists. Why? Because you haven't been able to get it for a long time like a lot of 90s vinyl, or if you could get it like a lot of 90s vinyl, it was extremely expensive. I have a sentimental place in my heart for this album. I would love to own a copy on vinyl. If I didn't already, I would be super pumped with owning this. That being said, do I think the music on vinyl is better? Yes, I do. If I had to do it all over again and I had to go out and pay the prices that this goes for now, would I? I don't know. I don't have to make that choice because I got this when it was still in print. That being said, I have paid 8 times or more for a different pressing of an album I already had. If you do want to buy this here, I will help you justify it though, because don't forget, even though we didn't cover it much in this video, this is a double album or a twofer that also has SAP on it. I don't have the Record Store Day release that was put out, but from what I hear, this one, this SAP version on here is also better. Thank you for joining me on a deep dive into the grooves of these 2 different pressings of Alice in Chains' Jar of Flies. If you liked the video, please take time to give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more content like this, please be sure to subscribe to the channel. I'd like to know your thoughts on these 2 pressings. Let me know in the comments below. I look forward to continuing the conversation there and responding to all of your comments. This is the VU Meters YouTube channel. I'm Rich. and I'll catch you on the flip side.